Good afternoon. Welcome to the Glendale Water and Power Commission meeting. Today's date is April 4th, 2011. Can we please have roll call?
Commissioner Jamian?
Present.
Commissioner Arminian? Commissioner Miller?
Present.
Commissioner Yao? President Chan?
Present.
Item 2, General Manager's comments.
Good afternoon. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes, and I mean just a couple of minutes, to go over a couple of interesting things that have occurred during the last month. First, I'd like to ask Peter Kavunas to come up and talk about something I think you'll find very interesting.
Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, members of the Commission. I'm Peter Kavunas, Assistant General Manager for Water. Glenn asked me to give you a very brief announcement. There's a industry conference called the American Waterworks Association California-Nevada chapter that happens twice a year. When it happens in Southern California, which it just did last week, it was in Long Beach, we try to have as many of our staff attend for a number of reasons. One is technical training, the other one is continuing education and credit hours that they get. Part of the conference includes competitions of skill and knowledge. The skill is either tapping a water main to see how quickly a water main can be tapped, or assembling a meter to see how quickly a meter can be assembled. Unfortunately, we're not very large. Larger utilities have an inherent advantage because they can have staff that can actually set a little time aside and go train to do those things, although our staff is pretty adept at tapping mains and assembling meters. There's a particular knowledge contest called the Top Ops, meaning Top Operations Contest, where they have teams from all the participating utilities compete and answer questions in a Jeopardy-style format. So very happy to report to you that the team of 3 that you see there are our guys volunteered on their own to participate, form their team. If they practiced, they did that on their own time, and they entered on their own, made it through the preliminary rounds, made it through the qualifying and championship round, and took 3rd, I think, behind Alameda County Zone 7, which is a pretty large utility, and San Francisco, which is also a pretty large utility. So we're very proud of our guys, and happy that they brought that distinction home. They took 3rd place.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to ask Ned Basson to come up and, again, give a brief description of the Mayor's Challenge on Clean Water.
Hello, I'm Ned Basson, Assistant General Manager, Customer and Support Services. Last week, the Mayor Najarian accepted a challenge laid down by the Wylands Foundation on clean water. And it is a challenge that goes all of this month, and it is to all of the cities to see which city can get the most people to go to the website and sign up to take the challenge. The website is wylandfoundation.org/waterpledge, and the copy is on the screen so that you can see it. It requires you to go to 3 screens to sign up. The concept is to just encourage people to participate in recognizing that there is a water shortage and that to conserve water. The foundation will provide awards to the members of the city that sign up that have the most people signing up. They'll have to do that on a basis of basically drawing their names because they don't have enough for everybody. But there are tickets to Angel Games, to Disneyland, and to some other events. So if you go to the wylandfoundation.org Water Pledge, you can sign up and try to make Glendale's name stand out in this pledge.
That's great. Thank you.
Ed? I'd like to give a quick overview of the dedication ceremony that we held this morning at the newly rebuilt Glorietta substation. And just as a quick review of what the Glorieta substation is, it's hard to see it here, but we completely rebuilt the existing Glorieta substation to new voltage levels, 69,000 volts at the transmission level and 15,000 volts at the distribution level. This is the latest in technology. It's a low-profile, completely enclosed substation, so from the outside, you can't even tell that it's a substation. It looks like a very attractive, contemporary building. Not only will it increase reliability in the Glorieta area and also in the Montrose and La Crescenta area, but it also represents our first true advance into distribution automation as part of our smart grid system. The particular substation was built with the latest technology, including the integration for everything associated with smart grid. So we're pretty excited about what this means for us, and this will create the basis for our pilot program for distribution automation smart grid. So this morning we had a dedication. We don't want to Eric Olson, who is our project manager on this job, said a few words on what the actual technology is with this substation. And Mayor Najarian theoretically energized it and turned on that light bulb, which is hard to see, but that substation was able to actually energize that light. We have a dedication plaque. Again, that's the mayor, and that's a representative of Beta Engineering, who was the contractor on the project this morning, including Councilman Friedman. We gave tours of the substation immediately after the actual dedication itself. There's the plaque. There's one of the transformers. There's 3 transformers in the substation, again completely enclosed, so they're not visible from the outside. The circuit breakers are what's known as SF6, which is a gas-operated breaker, very different from the older oil-operated breakers that we've had in the past. And this technology has allowed us to use a much, much reduced footprint for this particular substation than we would had we used the older. So that wraps up where we are with the Glorieta substation. It will be, in fact, truly energized tomorrow. We are ahead of schedule, and we are under budget. So I'm very, very pleased with the team that put this together, and I'm going to ask Ramon Abueg to now come up and speak about a recent mutual aid effort that we've.
Thanks, Glenn. That's great news.
Good afternoon, Ramon Abueg, HGM Electric Services. If you're not familiar with it, we did sign a mutual aid agreement with several utilities, and on March 25th, we received an email from PG&E asking for mutual aid because they ran into a lot of outages due to the storm that we're having throughout Northern California, and requested an overhead crew that can work on inclement weather. So they went all the way up north to the Humboldt area, down south to San Luis Obispo, Santa Cruz area, and our crew got sent to Santa Cruz. And just to give you an idea, there's a lot of utilities from the north and the south, and the whole idea of the CUEA is if one area is in trouble, the cities on the other side can help out, because the theory is, let's say we have an earthquake here, chances are the neighboring utilities will be too busy on their own, so we need to bring some support, and vice versa to the north. So what we did, we asked for a volunteer crew, and we got 7 guys who volunteered and very anxious to work, and the names are Richard Maddox, Bill Babishoff, Mace Lambert, Robert Torres, Troy Sturgill, Travis Fawns, and Ivan Cano. And I couldn't get a better picture. I did get the newspaper, but didn't get a chance to scan it. But they did have a lot of flooding in the Santa Cruz area, Capitola mainly, and they had a lot of downed trees and a lot of power outages. They had tens and thousands of customers that were out of power where our crews got sent. But their trip didn't go without challenge. This is what we realized is that because of the soot requirements on our diesel, they actually had problems with the truck before they got there because of the filter. It's limited to certain mileage, and so they had to get on the phone with the garage and figure out to make sure that they can get there safely. And this also proves that, or not proved, another consideration for when we are forced to go with CNG. For vehicles, we probably will not be able to provide the same support that we're able to provide. So that's something that we need to take a look at. So these are just some pictures of what they had to deal with. They had to deal with basically down wires and poles that are leaning. Go ahead. Again, a picture of a down wire. And tree that actually fell on the wires that needed clearing. Again, fixing some insulators and cross arms. And same thing, just fixing and putting service back. Go ahead. These are just some pictures. Okay. And these are the guys that volunteered. They truly appreciate it. And they got there, or they left GWP at 7 o'clock on Friday night. Didn't arrive in Santa Cruz until 4 in the morning. Got some rest. They went to work right away. And they were a little disappointed, actually, that by Sunday, PG&E decided to release all the outside support that they had. So, and they had hoped that they can work a little bit more, but I want to thank them for volunteering. So, and by the way, this is the first time we've ever done this, and the reason for doing this is we hope that we will be reciprocated if we do need some help from the utilities up north.
Were there action steps established, or what will you be doing from here?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
After this meeting, after seeing everything, were there action steps that anyone suggested?
Not really. The one thing that our crews learned are two things. It was a good team building process for them. At the same time, they realized that although we all work with the electric utilities, all poles look the same, but procedures and construction standards vary.
Okay. Thank you.
I'd like to commend the utility for being involved in this sort of organization, which, as I understand, allows mutual aid in the event of an emergency, and doubtless if there were a major quake down here, we would probably need assistance. I take it this was a drill, though, and you'll have additional drills.
That's correct.
Was there also discussion about exchange of materials and equipment in addition to labor for handling emergencies?
No, in this case, we had to use their materials. The guys had actually have to report to the yard. Okay. So our materials may not be interchangeable.
Okay.
So.
Has there been discussion of that to? I'd like to encourage exploration of that. There could be that there's some mutual advantage to sharing materials and equipment in addition to labor for this kind of thing.
Yeah, we don't with the further utilities, but within SCAPA, we have been looking at that to make sure that those that have the same ratings, same standards that we can share. So we do have some commonalities between us, LA, Riverside, and Burbank.
Very commendable. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Item 3A, approval of the February 7, 2011 meeting minutes.
Do we have a motion to approve both of the minutes, February 7th and March 7th?
I'll make a motion that the minutes for both meetings be approved.
I'll second.
Okay, so no objections. Motion carries.
Item 3B, approval of the March 7, 2011 meeting minutes.
I thought
We just
did
approved
both.
that one as
We just
well. Yeah, we moved both. Yeah,
Yeah.
to approve both.
Yeah.
Item 4A, water rate redesign, Wildan update, Bill Fox.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Bill Fox. I'm the Assistant Finance Director and Risk Manager for the City of and GWP. Today we have Wildan Financial Services. They're going to present to us a status update of where we are on our water rate redesign study. As you've recalled, the last several meetings we've had internal updates provided by myself, and last meeting we had made a suggestion that we have Wildan come and give us a briefing on where they are and to share with us some of the results as well as show the functionality of the model that they're developing for us. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Isaac Habib and Pierce Rosen.
Good afternoon, Commissioners of GWP. My name is Habib Isaac with Wildan Financial, as Bill mentioned. We're very happy to be here, and I'm going to give you a quick overrun of the primary objectives of this redesigned water rate study, as well as what we've done so far, where we are today, and the next steps, as well as some of the specific aspects of our model design and the functionality of the model itself. With me is my colleague, Pierce Rossman. He's the task manager on this project, and he'll be presenting, in particular, the consumption analysis that we're currently working on. So with that, so the primary objectives that we envision on this project is to provide adequate revenue in the short and long term, primarily defensible and equitable to be in compliance with Prop 218, as well as be flexible for the GWP in regards to being able to use this on an annual basis. We see that that's very important, as well as to be able to project what type of revenue increases you may need in future years. Also, what is critical in this project is to ensure that the water rates that are designed are in compliance not only with the Urban Watershed Conservation Council, but also with your internal mandatory conservation phasing. And depending on what phase you are, we want to make sure that it complements those particular documents and those principles. Some additional considerations that are very specific and unique to GWP are the fixed variable, which is how much revenue should be coming on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis from all your customers that are very stable, able to project very easily, and then how much should be allocated to consumption itself or as a commodity, which in turn means you could incentivize some of your customers to conserve as a goal. Also, what's going to be important is affordability. Whenever you have a rate increase, you got to keep in mind not only just the numbers, but also what is going to be the political landscape of any type of rate increase, as well as the affordability to your customers, and is it palatable? Are they going to get buy-in? And typically, if you have good education and could outline what the purpose of the increase is for, why rates are increasing, or what the dollars are going for, capital improvement plans, operations, wherever it may be, treatment, it makes it easier to absorb by your customers. So with that, whenever you do a water rate design, there's this balance between the costs that are incurred and what the rates that are going to be implemented. There's a number of competing factors, such as conservation and revenue stability. In particular, with this fiscal year and this wet season, there's been a huge amount of rain this year and precipitation that you're going to see a lot of your customers reducing their water use. Throughout the landscape of Southern California, it's very common where a lot of agencies are contemplating possibly doing a mid-year increase because they're seeing that their revenues aren't hitting what was projected when they adopted their most recent water rate increase. So you have to be able to balance those competing factors. And one way of us doing so is by generating our model, creating our model from the ground up. And you will see some of the components that we identify in our model is very, very specific to Glendale and the characteristics of your customer base. So with that, with those competing factors, the primary approach to any water rate design is you first look at revenue requirements, which is all the cost functions of the GWP and the way in which you incur those costs. And then with that, you then determine a cost of service analysis, and in compliance with Prop 218 to basically ensure that the costs that you're charging to your customers are directly related to the demand that they're placing on your system. And then once you get completed with that component, then you actually develop the rate design. And the rate design, this is where you can incorporate any type of uniform rates, the fixed variable, if you want to do some tiering to certain customer classes. Basically, what it comes down to is there's the revenue that you need, but then it's what are the means by which you're going to collect the revenue. And the way you collect the revenue, you're focused on equity vertically within the customer class that you're collecting the revenue from. The other component, though, is besides doing steps 1, 2, and 3, which seems to be systematic, very, very logical, because it's somewhat of a holistic approach. Whatever changes you make at the tail end, say rate design, if you tier or if you change your your fixed variable relationship, you also then need to go back and look and see how did that affect your overall revenue generations, as well as how you're allocating the cost between customer types. So it's not only just A, B, C, but it's also, well, now let's look at B because of the changes that were made. And if we make changes in step B, how does that affect your overall revenue increase? So you still have to do a revenue check and determine that the variables that you identify and what you set as your inputs make sense not only at the end, but also looking back if you need to make those changes. It's very critical, very important. Now, we have gone through the revenue requirements of GWP. We actually receive all the financial statements from staff. And one thing that we did with our model development is actually embed those financial worksheets of staff into the model itself. The reason being is ideally what we want this to work as is not only a model to update your rates for the next 5 years, we want it to be another tool in your toolbox that staff could utilize as part of their annual budgetary process. So if they see the worksheets and the financials that they're very familiar with on an annual basis embedded into the model itself, and it's all linked and correlated together, they'll automatically see updates with any type of changes that they make in their projections or their financials, whether it be CIP or maybe there were going to be different costs incurred due to the fact that you're moving over to a smart grid. These are items that you'll be able to see the actual impact by using the model as just another component of your budgetary process. And that was our intent. Some of the things we counted for, one thing that's important is the CIP. Besides just the fact that, yes, we have capital improvements, it's also the fact that GWP wants to transition more into a pay-go system as opposed to primarily using debt financing, although that's still a tool and that's still an option in our model that you could utilize and show what will be the effects of issuing municipal bonds. We have that in there, so you have that functionality. Another thing we did, besides looking at just a 5-year planning horizon, which is in compliance with Prop 218 and what you're allowed to go out for a notice, we did 10 years primarily because of the pay-go component. Whenever you start looking to transition to pay-go primarily, you also want to make sure you smooth out your capital improvement plan to ensure that there isn't one particular year that you see a spike because the certain infrastructure that's coming online. And if you do see that spike because of pay-go, you want to see what is that type of improvement. Does it make sense to spread over a longer time period? Does it make sense to issue debt? Or could we put off some other components that's part of your capital improvement plan to another year to smooth out that particular rate increase for that year? And then also what's critical is the interrelationship between the GWP Enterprise Fund and the General Fund for just indirect costs incurred from support services, central services, that is a function of the city that is being utilized by GWP to keep that interrelationship intact. And then another thing we talked with city staff, GWP staff on was the establishment of reserves, making sure existing reserves are up in regards to their level of funding, and also financial thresholds in relation to reserves. Now, one thing we want to establish besides your typical operating reserve is also a repair and rehabilitation reserve, in particular for the pay-go transition. So we incorporated setting up, establishing a reserve fund for repair and replacement. And in regards to financial thresholds, we also want to make sure that it doesn't deplete all the way down to zero every single year. You want to have some type of cushion or some type of minimum balance you want in there so you don't see these peaks and valleys within your revenue stream. Now with that, I gave you a lot of macro items in regards to the development of our model, and I want to move forward with the establishment of GUIDE. And what GUIDE is basically a dashboard that we create that's very specific to Glendale Water and Power. There's quite a few components in here, but in GUIDE, but what we did was basically break it out into 5 primary sections, one of which is not being utilized right now, which is on the bottom right, which is projected monthly bill, because we're not there in the rate design. Once the rate design is complete, you'll be able to see the changes in a customer's bill based on different levels of usage in comparison to what customers are paying today. So if you could click on the first, go ahead and hit enter. This primary section under the blue is the variable section, where we incorporate your any type of escalators, whether it be labor or materials and supplies. We also included very specific characteristics of GWP parcel configuration, where we know the average lot size of every single parcel, particularly single family. We know the average building square footage of single family homes. So essentially, we also know the average irrigable land area, which is important to know how much water people are going to use for outdoor use. We also included go ahead, go forward. This is where we have financial thresholds. And with financial thresholds, this is where we put minimum standards of, as I mentioned, the repair and replacement fund being able to not go under a certain threshold in a balance, as well as number of days of operating reserves. In this model, we put 90 days. And one thing I want to point out is that this is very general summary, but then within the next subsequent slides, we have close-up so you can see a little bit better. And go ahead again. And then on this section, whenever you make adjustments, what you also want to see from a more overview is your financials. What is going to be the effects on your financials in future years? The bars represent your costs, and the costs are broken out in different colors based on the different components, such as debt service or capital improvements or operations. Those are what those bars are for. And then the lines show what your revenue is from rates, as well as your ending fund balance. Go ahead. And then another item that we would incorporate into our model is scenarios that will be pre-programmed, and we'll be using this as part of the discussion process with staff. Whenever you're coming up with rate design, you always are typically going to ask, what if we do X, what if we do Y, what if we do Z? And what we tend to do, especially in this particular case, with that collaborative effort, is that we're going to have preset buttons set up where you could show scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3. You click on those buttons and it automatically shows the impact of certain recommended scenarios for your review and digestion. Go ahead. So with that, here's one of the sections of the model. This is revenue requirements. And within here, we have the 10 years. This is broken out in 5-year increments, so it can fit on this one slide. But the scenarios are quickly updated with the run scenario button, which is up top. And if you wish, what we have set up in our macro is basically that you could run the scenario and tell you what your revenue increase needs to be. However, for example, that first year in 2012, you would see a 28% increase. That's on the top row of proposed revenue increase, 28%. You might decide, or staff might decide, that is too high of a percentage increase in one particular year. If that's the case, we're going to make it, we have it set up right now where you could actually override that, put in, say you want less than 10%, you put 7%, you lock it, and then the model, you rerun the model, and then it'll tell you what will be the effect in future years from that condition that you set in stone. Go ahead. I'm not going to get into detail with this, but I wanted to just show that we have a number of variables that are very specific to Glendale water. One thing I mentioned earlier is that we have very specific parcel characteristics of your service area. The reason why we're able to do that is because another primary component of our service is doing annual administration of taxes and assessments. So we actually have all the parcel data from the county in our system, and we just extracted that data to utilize in the model. One other thing that we have that will be important is, say, for example, multifamily units. How many multifamily units are within your service area to make it equitable between single family and multifamily? I want to touch on the top right-hand corner, we have inflation and growth. On the top right-hand corner, we have single-family and multifamily. This is another unique characteristic to Glendale that we're adding, because what we see with the characteristics of Glendale is that you're potentially pretty much at built out, and if there's going to be new development, it's primarily going to be vertical, which means more multifamily units. So what we're tending to think and assume is that you're going to have a different growth pattern in the future for multifamily compared to single family. So we didn't want to group them together, just residential growth. We're breaking them up separately to look at, let's have a different growth rate of single family compared to multifamily. And we think that's very, very important in regards to Glendale Water and Power. Go ahead. As I mentioned, you'll be able to see the financial outlook of the changes that you make within our model. Go ahead. And then with that, I wanted to also just quickly open up the model, if you wouldn't mind. And then if it's okay, is it also okay for Pierce to make some adjustments to that model? I wouldn't want to put you in that position, George. I just wanted to show a little bit of functionality as part of this presentation. And one thing I want to point out in the very beginning before you look at any of this information is that we have a very defined structure to our modeling, which is everything that you see in light orange is an input to the user, or you could look at it as input to staff. And everything that is I guess you could call it gray or somewhat white, are outputs. So you don't touch that. As I mentioned, I just want to give an example of that 28% condition. Is there a possibility to zoom in a little bit? Control and zoom in? And go up to revenue. And Pierce, if you wouldn't mind, if you could go to reset. I just want to show you if you didn't do any type of increase whatsoever. Go ahead. All of a sudden it shows that you're going to have a negative fund balance in future years, which you cannot have. Also, it shows that your proposed revenue increase is 0 across the board. And we have conditional formatting, so it brings up right away that if it's in red, it shows up in red. 1, that means you're not meeting certain thresholds. The 2 primary thresholds we have in here is days of operating reserve, which we set to 90 days. So whenever you see less than 90 days, it's going to provide you a red flag by showing up as red. And then we also have in there your debt service coverage. Based on your covenants, it needs to be 125% coverage. If you had no rate increase, this will also show that you're not meeting the obligation. Go ahead and hit run. When you run this model, it automatically iterates and solves itself every single year until it meets those 2 conditions and tells you what the revenue increase needs to be. Once it finds out for that particular year, then it goes to the next year. And it continues on until the planning horizon. Now, I was going to give you an example visually to that 28%. If you wish that 28% wasn't enough, was too high, you could just lock it, and then you could actually manually enter in a value that you feel more appropriately, say 5%. Sorry, Pierce. Now it will show you that you're not meeting your conditions. However, if you run the scenario again, it's going to solve again. And now you see that in the second year, you're going to need 19% increase because This year, you didn't do the 28%. And you're going to have this functionality to work with. One thing I also want to point out, if you make the policy decision of only a 5% increase, it now shows you the result to this, however, is the fact that you only have 50 days of operating reserves as opposed to the target point of 90 days reserves. So that might be something that you say, I'm okay with, and I'll just build it up through time. But that's what some of the things I wanted to show you. And if you look at this, what we have in our presentation compared to what we had in our proposal, you'll see that it's completely different. And the reason why is because we're creating this from scratch. That's very specific to Glendale. Now with that, I want to turn it over to Pierce Rossman, who is going to go over the consumption data analysis. And this is currently what we're working on and finalizing right now. And then afterwards, I'll give you what our next steps are.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Pierce Rossum. I'll be going over the consumption analysis. As opposed to Habib, I'm going to be digging into the data, so getting kind of buried into some of the results. One of the big things I want to point out is there's a significant amount of data. We're analyzing 6 years of consumption data. That's about 1.2 million records. So every month or every bill that's sent out for the past 6 years, we're reviewing. The purpose of this, the purpose of the consumption analysis, is to really get an idea of who's consuming, when are they consuming, how does their consumption vary between customer class, between different users, and then how can we set rates based on that usage. So we really have to go in at a very detailed level and try to figure that out. So first I want to break out is single-family residential. Single-family residential, typically their units, their accounts are pretty similar. One single family is not going to vary dramatically different from another. So it's a good customer group to group up. So, go back. So by looking at this graph, what you can see is for the past 6 years, the peak and valleys that you see are winter months where consumption is typically lower. People aren't watering their outside, aren't watering their lawns, whereas in the summer, those sprinklers are running full blast and consumption really peaks. If you can kind of see over the past 6 years, there is a slight decline in consumption. So overall, the trend is declining, although the peaks still remain.
The effect of conservation, no doubt.
The effects of conservation is absolutely going to be one of them. Weather is another thing. If you can go back really quick. If you look at 2007, it was a hot year, a lot of consumption. But if you notice, the minimum of all of these years is pretty identical. It's pretty close. So that means people are generally conserving more in the summer. They're not running their sprinklers as much. And in the winter, it's a pretty baseline because growth wasn't there. Looking at single family, this is just number of accounts. It's interesting because the city of Glendale, GWP, has different billing cycles. Not everyone gets a bill monthly. Some are odd months, some are even months. So what we had to do is kind of blend the two together, and it's not exactly 50-50. So what we've done here is if you look at the blended, it's a weighted average of the odd billing cycle and the even billing cycle. I want to draw your attention to the 1.44 in the bottom right. This is peak. What peak is the average or the max month consumption over the average month consumption. So this shows if you baseline the consumption, you're going to be peaking at 144% during the summer. Another interesting thing that we like to look at is, if we're talking about tiering water rates for single family, if you set them at different tiering breakpoints, where are those tier breakpoints going to be, and how many people are going to fall within each category? What you see is a monthly bill. So the red line, the bottom line, is the minimum month. It's the low month. Green line is the average month, and blue line is the max month. And the percentiles are going up in 5% increments. So as you see, you look at 20 units, that's 20 HCF a month. In winter, if that was your break point for Tier 1, 50% of your bills would fall under Tier 1. Whereas in the summer, about only 15% would fall in Tier 1. The rest would jump into Tier 2. So that just kind of shows you a quick visual of if you were to set break points or tier points at certain levels, how many bills would fall under each category. Now I want to turn our attention to non-single family residential. Currently, GWP has two different rates. They have single family customer class and then have all others. Everyone gets the same type of rate. Non-single family residential has this number of customer classes. And I just want to bring your attention to this because, as you can see, within this customer group, there are a wide variety of uses. Some are barely using any water relative to others. And what our goal in this is to identify who's using the water and are they paying their fair share. And so what we want to make sure is our common use areas for condominiums, which is the far left, they're using the most water out of everyone. Are they paying their fair share compared to the city or multifamily or other commercial units? So if you go to the next slide. Right now, everyone's blended together. And if we look at blended, again, the bottom right number, you see 1.39. What happens is if we separate it out, this is the breakdown of customer classes. So you see that some are barely using any water over a max month, and some are using the majority of the water. If we go to the next slide, this really translates into different peaking factors for different customer classes. So when they're all lumped together, there are some winners and there are some losers. When we separate them out, we can identify who's currently paying their fair share and who's not. And also when you do the blended weighted average, you see that number goes up from about a 1.39, I believe the number was, to 1.88. And what this will help us do is make sure that the correct customer classes are getting their fair burden of costs. Again, with the percentile analysis, for commercial, if we look at it, 90% of the users are using a smaller amount of water. But when you look at that final 10%, the numbers really start to escalate. And so what our next steps are intended of doing is breaking out each customer class individually and running a percentile analysis on each individual customer class. That will help us better identify if there are certain bandwidths between certain customer classes or whether we can appropriately group some of the customer classes. And with that, that's a consumption analysis. Next steps, we're going to continue with the consumption analysis. Like I said, there's a lot of data, so we haven't been able to get into all of it. The net plant investment. Part of the issue is when you're identifying costs and who should pay their fair burden. When you're talking about debt service, when you're talking about CIP, who's paying their fair share and how does that cost get allocated? The net plant investment does that. So what we're doing is we've asked GWP to go through their CIP and identify which portion of each capital project is attributed to a number of different classifications. And that way we can allocate those costs based on those classifications. And then I'm going to throw it back to Habib for the rate design.
Thank you. Now, also with the rate design, what we intend to do is, in regards to time frame, is we've been having quite a few meetings with staff, and I would envision that within the next 3 weeks we'll have a meeting in regards to approaches of tiering, what the rate design should be in relation to what Pierce mentioned in regards to non-residential. Does it make sense to have a uniform rate, or does it make sense to have a tiered rate? And should because there are different uses in non-residential, should we have it set up where every distinct customer class of non-residential has their own independent rate that's reflective of their peaking and the demand they placed on the system? Because there will be some instances where it doesn't make sense to group certain uses of commercial. And then also, we want to ensure what are the objectives of residential in regards to tiering, ensuring also rewarding those that are efficient, rewarding those that may be on fixed incomes that are just going to utilize what is necessary. There's a way in a way you structure the tiering to ensure that you have a very low tier for efficient use, very efficient use, and a tier for efficiency going all the way to wasteful. Whenever we do any of those type of tierings, they relate to the percentile analysis that Pierce mentioned, because we're going to be able to let you know in tier 1, which would say is that very efficient usage, 100% of all your accounts are within this tier, except for maybe when there's those that go on vacation and they shut off their water for that time period. So you're going to know that, in tier 1, I'm going to generate all the revenue possible in tier 1. In tier 2, maybe 80% of your customers based on consumption data falls in there. So besides just setting up the tiers, we're also going to help you with what's the financial impact and how much consumption falls within those tiers. So then we could correlate that with your actual costs. So as you lose consumption in the higher tiers, what the costs you want to lose are those that are directly related to consumption, such as treatment or other components or conservation objectives that you want to encourage, and you're not going to be losing revenue that's going to go to debt service or that's going to go to your primary operations. That's going to be a collaborative effort, and that's going to be what we're going to be working on the next steps. Do you still have the model open? If you could go to Revenue Requirement tab, it's 2 over from Guide on the toolbar, all the way down. As you can see here, we have everything listed in regards to revenue requirements. We have it all set up. We have our inputs. And then, Pierce, if you go to the causation, we have the same costs again listed throughout. And once we finish the consumption analysis, we're going to be able to identify the relationship between your base, your average usage compared to your peak. And what that does, it enables us from line item by line item by line item, identify how much of the cost should be allocated to your base, how much of the cost should be allocated to peak, and what percentage should be allocated to peaking, or which would be a variable cost. And the reason once we get done with the consumption analysis, that's going to be able to allow us to put in these inputs and then be able to work with staff to identify what's the best means to spread certain costs. So we already have this information incorporated. We have the model set up. We just have to finish the consumption analysis to then start getting into the rate design and then seeing of how detailed you want to be, all the way to the point where single family could be based on the particular characteristics of the parcel because of the area of the lot, things of that sort, because we have that data. So with that, I want to also open up to any questions or comments you may have that Pierce and I can address.
Very impressive presentation. Thank you very much. Your model, I take it, is Windows-based.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's Excel, but it's in Windows, Microsoft.
Okay. If the utility at some point wanted to segment its customer base differently, let's say based on information from Smart Grid, how flexible is your system to adapting to that?
We could incorporate it in regards to Smart Grid. Just if it's not the entire customer base, or just a subset of customers that are on Smart Grid currently, and then and then there's other customers that are not?
Well, not so much that. I'm thinking, for example, you've got customers maybe who are, I guess they're broken up by single-family residence and multifamily residence right now. Maybe the utility based on smart grid might want to categorize the customer base somewhat differently, maybe on usage within single-family residence or something like that. Would it be easy to go into your system to make changes to include the additional categories that the utility might be interested in doing?
Yes, we would just have to create new customer classes based on those characteristics, which would be available from the additional data that would be available from the smart grid application.
You mentioned inflation. That's very good. You mentioned inflation also in your discussion. I took it really the inflation there had to do with lot size related to multifamily and single-family residence, but you also have accommodation for financial inflation, I take it, or
Yes.
monetary inflation, I should say.
There are 6 factors currently right now that was right underneath the growth rates that I identified of single-family, multifamily. There's 6 other components that are labor escalation, materials and supplies escalation, capital improvement escalations. So there's 6 identified currently because we feel that there might be certain components that are going to inflate by a different index than others.
Okay, that's excellent. Go ahead if you wanted to point that out.
On the screen right now, as Habib said, in the column D, the escalation code, what you'll see is different cost categories, MATS, E, MWD, and what these codes are all the different inflation factors that we've developed. The most important one here is probably, as Habib showed, there's a drop-down menu, and as you change any of the factors, it all gets inputted throughout the model. So each line item is individually inflated.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good. Is there going to be training provided to staff, not only in the operation, but if they wish to alter maybe certain formula, are they going to be trained in the formula as well?
Yes, and part of the reason why we have the whole collaborative effort is so you don't see the model in day 90. You're working with the model the entire process. So while training will be provided, it's going to be a smoother transition once we get to training.
Okay. You also mentioned determining cost allocation to make sure that there's an equitable payment by various categories of customers. Let's say with respect to capital costs, if there's a particular project that benefits one category of customer more than another, that they would pay more for that. What kind of customer communication is envisioned? And maybe that probably goes beyond the scope of your contract, but or maybe it does not. I don't know. But do we have some kind of is there going to be a customer communication process with respect to that? In other words, the customer gets informed that he's benefiting from a particular project more and so would be expected to pay more, and he's allowed to respond to that?
That's going to be further down the road, but
Okay.
I think the education efforts is going to be more in regards to why the structure was selected or the one that we're going to move forward with.
Okay.
And how is this going to affect you? In regards to CIP, it was more to ensure that when we do the enough time investment, to ensure that we're not just identifying CIP as one line item, and because there could be many components that make up that CIP that is a function of a different driver that creates that need. So we wanted to make sure that we're spreading capital improvement costs based on the actual driver of that need, including debt service, as opposed to lumping it all as one and then using just one factor to spread the cost over. But if there's a particular item that only a few benefit from and is very specific, then I don't see why we would not incorporate that into the literature.
Okay. Any comment on that?
Well, I just want to make an overall comment that this task is really an analysis and a recommendation of a number of different options of which way to proceed. Once that's finished, then we at GWP will actually go
Right.
outreach and talk to the customer.
Okay, well, that certainly makes sense. And then I just have one final question for now. I want to thank my fellow commissioners for letting me carry on this long. We have some other financial viability indicators, things like a contingency reserve, percentage of days of cash to fund operating expense. Are those also included in the model? I didn't see them in your, excuse me here. This particular, you probably can't recognize it, but you had a couple of lines here related to some critical financial operation indicators that are going to be very important for the utility in terms of determining what to do, days of operating expenses and calculated debt coverage ratio, but there's also some others, and presumably they're located elsewhere in the model.
We do have, in regards to revenue requirements, all the line items that make up the current GWP expenditures, including reserves, and then there's some existing reserves that we grouped as either operations related or related to repair and rehabilitation that we're then grouping together into the dashboard, you could say.
Yeah.
So you can use that as a function, but those are within the modeling.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to commend you. This is a great model. It shows the comprehensiveness and all the different factors included, and including all the important drivers. My question is, when is this scheduled to be completed?
Currently, I would anticipate, as I mentioned, in about the next 3 weeks, we'll start getting into the rate design and providing some scenarios. And I would envision that the rate design process would probably be another 4 weeks. So I would envision it's going to be right around May, the month of May, where we'll have some very concrete, specific scenarios to work with staff on, and however many is going to be presented to the commissioners.
And when we talked about the 3.8% increase several months back, did we go over like the schedule for this? When were we going to come in with the rate increase proposal?
We excuse me. We talked about roughly end of June, beginning of July timeframe to have something not necessarily in place, but ready to put forward. And this, so far, we're right on schedule.
We're right on schedule. Okay, great. Thanks.
Two questions. One is, we didn't hear anything, or I should probably ask. You said you guys have a lot of information or databases where you take all the parcel information.
Yes.
Do you guys also have databases that talk about low-income families, and how do you account for such issues? I'm assuming this is going to be part of the rate redesign. I didn't hear you guys talk about that at all. So can you talk about that briefly?
Sure. We don't have databases in regards to a flag of which homes, property owners are low income or senior citizens, things of that sort. Typically, what you tend to do in rate design to account for that is to have very low or multiple low tierings. So you could limit the rate that you have to charge to those low tiers. So then you give them price signaling of what they should stay within based on the amount of water that you need for indoor use on a per capita basis. One thing our model identifies is indoor need per capita, and currently we're using 100 gallons per day per capita. And then that's very common in like waste treatment processes, that's what you typically expect to receive. So that's what we're using right currently. The only other item that maybe is there are other agencies that have separate funding to provide a source of revenue for those type of customers through filling out, a specific form and then submitting it on an annual basis, maybe based on if they qualify with their electrical needs.
And one other question. I believe when we talked about the 3.8% increase and then set a schedule for the overall rate redesign, one of the information we wanted to have was some feedback from the smart grid. how much information are we incorporating in what you're doing from the smart grid now, or plan on doing a month or two as you guys?
If I can touch on one item so far is one thing that I do want to obtain, which is going to be a follow-up request, is to get the consumption data for these last months in 2011, and primarily because it was such a wet year. It would be a good basis for a very wet year if you want to look at maybe one of your worst case scenarios of reduced consumption. I'm not sure if smart grid is already part of consumption data of these last few months. I believe it is. But also, the only thing that we have incorporated is if there's going to be more incurred costs because of smart grids. And another thing we're going to need to know is, with the smart grid implementation, are you going to be charging now everyone on a monthly basis because it may be more automated, or are you going to continue with the process of bi-monthly with different cycles because that's also going to cause a change in your costs as well?
We will have some smart grid data available. If you recall, smart grid meters will not be fully operational till most likely sometime this summer, which means that as we move ahead, we're starting to get data now. So we are getting data, and we do have some, but we won't have a complete, comprehensive amount of data until this summer. So at that point, that data will then be completely available, whatever we do, modeling or new structures.
And also, we have 6 years of data. So one thing we can do when we receive that information, if it's a revenue test or consumption analysis, we could compare those particular accounts that are on smart grids with what their usage patterns were in the previous years to see if there's a significant difference between what they're using in smart grid today.
That was my point. You're using 6 years of data, and I wanted to see if the new data we receive is, greatly different, or is it similar?
Right.
Comparing obviously to a similar type of a wet year.
Mm-hmm.
And is this rate proposal going to be just for 1 year or multiple years?
Well, this will put a foundation in place for multiple years.
Multiple years. Okay.
I'd like to thank you once again for the presentation. Very helpful.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
The public speaker, Herbert Milano.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Commissioners and the Chair, I want to take a few minutes to try to synthesize what was just presented to you in quite a bit of detail. I'm very appreciative of the fact that we have a lot of variables in trying to determine these rates. And I have a bit of admiration for the work that was done in creating a spreadsheet that considers all of these calculations. But I have a few problems that I'd like to point out. The first problem really is that this city does not have a rate advocate. I mean, you are it. But as such, there is really no one looking out for the rates that we could afford. We have a problem in the city that, in the way it is structured, less than 30% are single-family homes. And within that group, there is a significant number of residents with fixed incomes. Many of residents that I've talked to while helping out on the campaign of a couple of the people who are running for office, who tell me of their difficulty in trying to figure out how to reduce their water consumption in order to meet, their fixed income. There's also the problem that they're addressing, obviously, with regard to their size of their lot and how much greenery they have. And of course, as you all know, most of the water consumption is about irrigation. And then we have this whole other problem that takes up 70% of the population. And the majority of that 70% in multifamily housing don't pay for water directly. We, the landlords, do. And there's no separate metering. So we have an additional burden that we have to account for. In the last couple of years, my revenues have dropped by 15%, meaning overall rentals and so forth. But my water rates have not maintained with regard to that reality. And of course, my tenants are not impacted, even though I do communicate with them. So when I look at this model, it starts with that you're looking at the revenue requirements first as your driver, and then everything else falls below that. And I think that maybe this model should be relooked at again, as you start to look at more at what costs components are there and how we could control those costs so that these costs do not automatically go out there. For a long time, I've been trying to collect information on a year-to-year basis on labor, separately from retirement benefits and other benefits, the M&O, the capital improvement, in a way that allows me to look at those rates in the same charts year to year. Because I think that it behooves us or a rate advocate to come back to the GWP and say, wait a second, you just increase your benefits by 20%. What is that impact is going to have on these rates, and what impact is that going to have on the eventual consumer and their ability to pay those bills? And I think to that extent, there's a bit of a disconnect. And the disconnect stems from the fact that we don't have a rate advocate looking out for that. When I look at these numbers and the averages that I use and the assumptions that I made, I'm sure that they come from other assumptions from other cities and other entities. And Glendale is different in many regards. But because we have so many master meter buildings, I think we need a rate advocate for the multifamily user to come in and basically give the input. No one in multifamily has come to speak as often as I have. No one has ever given me a call and say, Mr. Milano, come on, give us your input and and the effect that it has had on your finances. So, when I pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars every time the bill comes through, I think about it and says, well, who's taking care of my interest here? I do encourage conservation. My tenants use less than 200 gallons per day. Personally, in my home, we use in a single-family home, less than 80 gallons for the whole family per day. So I'm very much pro-consumption, but I think that there are two things that need to be looked at. How do these variables impact the customer's ability to pay, and how does these practices impact the overall water usage of the whole city? So that if we have a goal to say we're going to use 27,000 acre feet per year, that we say, all right, we're going to aim we work these tables out based upon that goal or the affordability goal. I think that this model is predicated on the water and power ability to be able to stay financially, should we say, solvent. And that's well and good. But I think there's a whole other area that needs to be looked at, and the model is insufficient in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Milano.
Item 4B, risk management update. Glenn Steiger.
Thank you. GWP currently retains the services of a consultant risk management, or RMI, to do our overall energy risk management oversight. They've been with us for about 2.5 years now in this regard. And so we've asked them to come and give an overview of what they're doing for us and generally what they see within the scope of energy risk management generally and how it affects GWP. I'd like to ask Phil Fox to introduce RMI.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring up John Snell. He's a director with RMI. They're located in Chicago, and they have multiple clients. And they're going to share with us a little bit about their organization, what they do on an overall basis, and then specifically what they've done for GWP. With that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Thank you very much, and good evening, Commissioner. I guess it's good evening. I broke this into 3 segments, as Bill just said, where the first part's a little bit about us, just so you get a background on where we're coming from, and then a little bit of an overview on how we perceive, in a macro sense, the risk practice of energy price risk management, and then get into how this is how Glendale works, or the workings of Glendale's risk management program actually impact you all. With regards to RMI, we are from Chicago. We've been around since 1988, and frankly, this slide gives us, we are involved in every bit of the risk management, what we'll call the risk management process, and it gives you a little bit of an overview of how we perceive risk management, and that we really look at it as three separate entities or three separate areas. The first being the strategic development of what types of strategies are needed or used within your entity, in this case, electric utility. The middle piece is really the portfolio management or the risk function, making sure that at the end of the day, the execution piece and the trades that are being done are doing so to satisfy the strategies, and there's an internal control involved in the process, in the middle process, which is really where our function is with you all here at Glendale. And also, too, to getting back, you can go ahead, George. To our credentials, as I mentioned, we've been around since 1988 and have helped to develop and execute over 80 risk management programs for corporate clients. We do actually also execute as much as $16 billion, or over $16 billion in notional value of energy contracts on behalf of our clients. We have a significant utility business, that is gas and electric utility business. Our customers actually purchase in the physical markets over 2 TCF of natural gas each year, which is approximately 10% of the natural gas consumed in the United States. Also, we have a combined, those customers have a combined generation of in excess of 80,000 megawatts of electric generation. We are a significant introducing broker executing both NYMEX and ICE contracts. And our customer base, this is a rough approximation, but it's roughly 80-plus customers, about 27 of which are investor-owned utilities, 23 commercial industrial corporations, and then 32 gas and electric municipals across the country. And with that, a little bit about risk management itself. We had some 80-some customers, and of course our philosophy typically is the same, except that out of those 82 customers, each customer is a bit different. There's a generic way to look at risk management, which is important, but each entity has a little bit different risk profile. Their generation mix is different, so there certainly is a different touch to each customer. Generically, if you look at the left, the difference is generally, again, based on the company or the industry they're in. The consumption patterns could be certainly different. How they purchase commodities might vary depending on the part of the country they're in or other variables. If you look at generically the charts at the very top of this, we do some business with government organizations. I say government like the Department of the Navy, for instance. We procure all the electricity for the Department of the Navy in California, as a matter of fact. And they have a long-term budget cycle of 3 or 4 years, and very price certainty is an extreme for them. And of course, most electric utilities have a need for, a desire for at least a large degree of price certainty. Of course, the other side of the coin is of course, tolerance to volatility in the marketplace. An extreme example there are gas utilities tend to be a little more tolerant as they have pass-through mechanisms to their customer, and then of course transportation companies that might have freight surcharges, again passing through any price risk onto their ultimate customer and bearing the brunt of the volatility. And again, I can't stress enough the whole process here for energy risk management. It is a circle, because I put this in a circle because it is a process, not a process that actually starts and ends at some point. That is, the risk management piece of that in the upper right-hand corner really goes to the fact that you develop a policy and procedure. What types of hedging strategies do you really need, and what types of strategies are right for your particular needs? Once that is done, of course, there's the execution piece, which is what platforms we're using, what tools are we using, who are we executing through. And then, of course, the data management reporting is really the risk management function of making sure that we capture those trades and make sure they are actually doing what they're expected to do with regards to the strategies, and make sure that the internal controls are in place, that the people executing are doing what they're assigned to do and nothing more. And the reality is that the risk management, there's 3 broad areas that we look at. The first one, and this is really true of any business, the first one is really market risk, which I think is somewhat self-explanatory. The energy markets have traditionally been extremely volatile commodities, and by the very nature of the business, there is market risk. Along with that market risk, of course, you can also look at your volumetric risks that are certainly inherent in any gas or electric utility, and things like that also fall under that same category. The second area would be administrative risk. Of course, this includes making sure that you have double checks in place and checks and balances to make sure you minimize human error, and certainly, of course, fraud is another issue that comes up from time to time. And last but not least, often overlooked in times of calm, but certainly credit risk is a major variable in any energy risk management program, making sure that those that you're dealing with are credit worthy and keeping track on an ongoing basis of what your exposures might be to any particular given credit counterparty. And two, it gets back to, with regards to the hedging processes, what we're trying to do with risk management, and this is simply a basic definition, is we're trying to identify, control, and minimize exposure to adverse commodity price movement. We, of course, you all as a utility are considered to be hedgers, trying to minimize risk of adverse movement. Much different than what a speculator might be, obviously, with one who's in here trying to attempt to profit from forecasted price movement. And with regards to getting down to the GWP checks and balances, one thing I'll start out with is we do have every year a head survey, and we're not survey takers by trade, but because of the largeness of our customer base, we do have a anonymous survey asking for various hedging tendencies for our significant utility base. In this particular survey, we asked how much gas they buy with regards to this survey, and I think this did represent the buying of over 2 TCF of natural gas, and specifically for utilities. And we asked what were your goals and objectives of your energy price risk management program. And as you can see, front and center to that was in fact 86% of them responded to reduce the volatility or inherent in the costs of energy. And secondly, we wanted to make sure we had some catastrophic price protection in high price environment. Of course, internal controls are always in everyone's mind, diversified portfolio, making sure we don't, so to speak, throw all your eggs in one basket, and of course, peer review, making sure you're in the ballpark of others in what they're doing and how they're managing price risk. And with regards to Glendale's policies and procedures, of course, their objectives focus very strongly on 2 major factors that came up in that survey. The first one is, and their primary reason for doing this, is stabilizing the cost of their energy associated with, or the associated risk with that energy, while maintaining a reliable energy supply for retail customers. That is the heart of really what we're attempting to do. Secondly, though, as you enter into this endeavor, you also want to make sure that you're providing specific procedures, segregations of duties, and oversight for the management of the operational risks that are involved or inherent in any utility. And in the policy itself, you can point out certain procedures here that certainly provide the framework that we're talking about. The whole point here is to identify, capture, measure, manage, control, monitor, and report financial and other risks on an ongoing basis, on a daily basis. And the concept here is to maintain the proper controls in executing the strategies in which are necessary in any regulated utility. And then, too, the administrative risk is always front and center. It's very important and something to watch on an ongoing basis to make sure that everyone involved in the process has a piece of the process, if you will. Really, down from the city council on down, the checks and balances are in place, that there's an oversight that certainly really centers, I think, mostly on of course, the Energy Risk Management Committee, which we'll talk about in just a second, which is, of course, headed by the general manager. And that entity right there really makes many of the oversight decisions that I think are very inherent in making sure that this process flows smoothly. And that governs, or that committee is outlined here with the members, as you can see. The general manager is the chairman, and of course the assistant manager of general supply, the risk manager, the assistant general manager of finance, and a city manager representative advisory, non-voting members as well. And as you can see from their primary responsibilities, they are what I would call the oversight committee to the whole process. Really, when it comes down to reviewing what they're doing and how they're moving forward, this is key to the process. And I come back to the process or the breakdown of the three areas we're talking about on the next page, the segregation of duties. We really have divided, and of course, the standard operating procedure divided the process into three distinct areas. That is the front office, the middle office, and the back office, with the front office being obviously the responsibility of the energy marketing section and the energy traders themselves with regards to who they're doing business with, the deal structure, the pricing. Obviously, they are executing or responsible for the hedging and positioning of the day-to-day trading. The middle office, again, is part of the control, or is basically the control function, making sure, again, that, as I said in that initial slide, that the hedges and the strategies that were expected to be executed are executed in the proper manner with the proper people, with the proper volumes. And at the end of the day, then the back office is responsible for the reconciliation, the accounting, and bookkeeping as they do today. By the way, just along the bottom, the middle office has been is very robust. And then, of course, we are part of the middle office. There, particularly in the city the size of Glendale, you have an internal risk manager, but at the same time, they have outsourced several functions to allow for, frankly, greater checks and balances. We are providing a lot of the facilitation of the risk management function in the middle, along with, as far as the hedging strategy itself, it's devised by in conjunction with the Glendale people, advised by the Energy Authority, TEA, on the left-hand side, and we're closely with the front office. And then ACES Power Marketing on the right-hand side, another very large provider of risk management services for municipals and cooperatives throughout the United States. They are providing much of the counterparty credit evaluations and updates on an ongoing basis as the front office requires more trading partners or looks for more trading opportunities. And as far as the hedge strategy is concerned, the strategy itself is, again, looking at trying to stabilize pricing. And with regards to the natural gas hedging strategy, again, minimizing volatility, it's relatively active management and modification of hedge positions based on market conditions. And, of course, another consideration is trying to minimize the financial cost of the hedge program itself. There's also another hedge program, or another part of the hedge program is specifically around the landfill gas, which is the purchase of puts underneath the fixed price of that landfill gas that hopes to protect the market from any downslide, if you will. And the other thing I mentioned was the credit mitigation, which, of course, in this day and age, in my tenure in this business, which has been 30 years, it seems like we go through fits and starts about the concerns over credit. And, of course, you go back 10 years, we had the Enron issue, and all of a sudden everyone's very, very, very concerned about Enron. Well, things quiet down, and this gets taken to the back a little bit. But then 2 or 3 years ago, the banks, which many of whom took some of the slack up in the energy marketing business, they ran into significant problems, and once again, credit risk became a big concern. In our opinion, it's always a concern. It should always be a concern on an ongoing basis to know where you're at, both from a legal standpoint as well as a exposure standpoint, dollar exposure standpoint on a daily basis is extremely critical with every counterpart that you deal with. And I think through the process that we've developed here at Glendale, it's a very robust process to make. And again, I have to say it is still risk management, not risk elimination, because there is inherent risk in everything you do. But I could say that we are very diligent in making sure that this credit piece is well taken care of. The counterparty approval process from us with regards to what ends up happening is the front office is really on the front lines of the trades, and they're advising us on desired counterparties or enabling agreements that they wish to enter into. And I will also stress that the enabling agreements are an equal and important part of the process. Again, anything that happens, or if there is a problem or concern after the fact, obviously the legalities of the circumstance fall back to the contract you're dealing with. So industry standard contracts are used, but making sure that they are written properly is important. We are the facilitators with the legal department of Glendale to the front office to get those contracts approved in hopefully a timely manner, but certainly dotting every I and crossing every T is very important to us. As you go back just a second, George, I'm sorry. Also, too, with regards to the counterparty approval agreements, we work with ACES on the bottom there. ACES Power Marketing does review the proposed counterparties and recommend limits, analyzes guarantees, and provides reporting on an ongoing basis in case there's any issues. There's a bit of a double check in that we too provide that, I guess, to some degree, or secondary support, in that if we see something through our network of operatives, we certainly bring it to the attention of Glendale as well. In the counterparty approval process, as I just mentioned, it goes through ACES. This is a sample again, generic sample of the type of reporting processes they come through, and they do make recommendations on what types of credit limits to certainly allow, and so far the process has run very smoothly. And also the guarantee process is very important. One of the things that certainly come up in the credit analysis is many companies obviously use subsidiaries, et cetera, and it's common practice in many businesses. Certainly it's true in energy. So to be understanding of who you're dealing with and whether or not that specific entity has the backbone and wherewithal or financial backbone to support trading, the trading environment is very critical. And if it is not, then we do require guarantee process to go through to make sure that the parent would guarantee any financial setbacks that subsidiary may have. And there is a master counterparties list that comes out that outlines exactly where things are, what processes can be, or what potential trades can take place. Of course, it's not a cookie cutter circumstance. It all depends on the credit as to what type of not only sums you're allowing that counterparty to be exposed to, but also what type of trading you'll actually do with him. And on an ongoing basis, the traders get this report every day, or get a expanded version of this report that really shows what type of where they are with their counterparts, what they do, and what type of limits that they now have still available to them on an ongoing basis. And also, too, the other thing that I did want to point out at this meeting, which I think is important, is it was once said to me by another customer, and I think it's very appropriate, that the policies and procedures of an energy management program really are not a static document. They should be a living document, meaning that they should be reviewed every once in a while. And to that point, too, one of the things that we look forward to doing is in fact reviewing these processes over the near term to make sure that everything is at industry best standards. The industry changes from time to time, and tweaks are certainly necessary from time to time, but diligence on not only providing a good risk management program, but keeping it at the forefront of what is industry best practices is certainly something we strive to do with all our customers, including Glendale. And last but not least, at the end of the day, I think that really what we're trying to do here is, of course, what Glendale's trying to do with their energy risk management is provide or utilize markets that are liquid and transparent, provide some insurance against catastrophic rise in prices, provide price stability and certainty to the ratepayer, be prepared to, of course, lock in or secure historic value for input costs, be competitive with our peers, and to make this process methodical, not speculative. And of course, as unknown variables do occur, be it weather, war, or the economy, we're not here to guess, we're here to manage price. And with that, open for questions.
I went first last time. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Thank you so much for the comprehensive report. There's been quite a few discussions in the past on this issue, and quite a few of the commissioners have asked questions. I see the whole plan is discussed here, and what the different strategies are, et cetera. The question I have is, as part of your services, do you backcast? do you look back, like over the year or two, to see how well your hedging strategies were?
First of all, RMI does not come up with the hedge strategy. That was the Energy Authority that did that. However, I will speak to that. Glenn, you may pipe in too. We are not big proponents, and so we didn't come up with this hedge strategy, but we are not big proponents necessarily of back testing. The reason being is it's very difficult to look at the same set of circumstances and suggest that it would be the same as it was the last 5 years. Case in point, we could take crude oil right now, for instance, and the person that knew that Egypt and Tunisia and Libya would cause what would be arguably, I saw a Goldman Sachs letter suggesting that this has added $15. That situation that came out of nowhere 2 months ago has added $15 a barrel to the price of crude oil. And of course, nobody would have known that prior to that circumstance. And in the case of natural gas, gas-fired generation could be a significant issue this summer or not, depending on the weather. And in my experience, weather has been very difficult to find out what it's going to be tomorrow, much less 6 months from now. So it's very difficult to compare time frames. I think realistically, when you look at the objective of Glendale, and really the 86% that said price stability is key, at the end of the day, with relatively docile prices, you want to be involved in securing a good value for the business of generating electricity and doing that for hopefully longer periods of time at cheap prices. So back testing, the answer to your question is we didn't devise this one, but we're really not big proponents of it because looking back usually isn't necessarily it could or could not be a good indicator of the next 5 years versus the last 5 years.
I would agree with that for short term, as you indicated. I think if we were to look back over a period of time and just see, how we were able to perform financially, comparing to what strategies we applied, I think it's a learning experience that we all can gain from. I guess if your company does not offer that service, maybe we in-house can look at that if we can afford staff time, just to review over, how our hedging investments have done for ourselves over the years.
Yeah, we have been looking actually at establishing metrics, which is basically what you're talking about. And it's interesting to hear the comment that our consultant basically doesn't really look at these things, and there's a good reason for that. Difficult. It's extremely difficult. Even if you could project a fairly stable future, to try to determine what would have been in the past is just as difficult. So what we were finding is trying to actually determine what the metrics are to measure is not nearly as simple as we thought it would be. But we are looking at that, and we continue to do so.
One thing I'll add to Glenn's comments is what we typically do with customers, and it is a good thought to benchmark how you're doing. But to benchmark against the markets is a little bit different because remember, specifically just against the market and after the fact, it's difficult because remember, you're trying to protect against unknown variables as much as you are. You're certainly not trying to speculate on price. What we've found is benchmarking maybe to the objectives of the program. That is, are we really reducing the volatility in price? Well, you can measure that. You can look at statistically the volatility of your price versus the market. Another great variable is, okay, go back and look at, well, where could I have bought? You don't have to wait till the last minute, but where could I have bought the price over the last 2 years, and how did I do in that system? And I've had in my 30 years, I've had people say that if you have a really, really good, if you did really, really good, got better than lower than the half of where you could have bought it over the last couple of years. You didn't buy the low, but you bought lower than maybe what would have been the last 18 months you could have bought this month at. Another variable, variables like that may come into play as maybe a collection of benchmarks put in more of a scorecard, if you will, to see where you've gone right or wrong. It really, the concept of looking at simply after the fact where you were versus the markets is a bit unfair, because that's not the objective of the program.
And the benchmark, the metrics that you just described, I think those would be very helpful to
we very much
reviewing.
propose.
That's
we
right.
very much propose.
As we go.
Can you talk a bit about how your energy risk management program works with our renewable energy portfolio?
Renewable energies are the only piece of the program that really retouch is going to be the purchase power and the gas generation. The renewable energies piece is a little bit of a specialty item, I guess you might say, to some degree. And that's not just true of Glendale, but it's typically true of the market, because you have subsidies that are driving renewable energies, at least right now, and the pricing of that product is almost a unique animal. It's separate and distinct from the raw price of natural gas, for instance, and hence it takes on a different. It's not just with you all, but it generally takes on its own set of circumstances which is not involved in this particular, these two hedging plans, if you will. Because of the subsidies and everything else, you go out and buy solar in California, it has to do specifically with the solar generation market in California because of the renewable energy mandates, et cetera, and the subsidies. You just have a whole different pricing mechanism. So, in time, will that change? Yes. But as we speak today, the wind or solar or renewables that would be specific to they're going to all have different pricing mechanisms, largely because of the mandates in each state.
I take it that you mean then that renewable energy is not included then in your hedging or other risk mitigation strategies. Okay. I wanted to ask on your slide 12, or it's listed here as page 12, this is on your survey of, which I presume was of your customer
That's
base,
correct.
or of at least a segment of it, or a portion of it, on the reasons they were going for hedging and other risk mitigation strategies. Where does GWP actually fit there? Are we primarily in volatility reduction and catastrophic price reduction? Does this kind of also reflect what
In reality, all the first three are mentioned in your policies and procedures, and that is front and center to where you are.
Okay.
Volatility reduction, catastrophic price protection, and of course, internal controls by themselves don't do anything for you, but they're extremely important as being part of the risk management process.
Okay. Yeah, we've been plaguing the staff with questions about how do we show that the investment in risk management is paying for itself. And, I think this was helpful in clarifying that this is like insurance very much, and that we can't really make that assessment. I think that came out in your answer to Commissioner Chen regarding the short-term assessment. I don't know if we have enough data to make a long-term assessment. My guess is we don't. Yeah. So, but maybe we can continue looking at this as you had suggested. But one thing we can do maybe is compare ourselves with other utilities, investor-owned or public, to see how their insurance, so to speak, compares with ours. And do we have any information on that?
No.
Yeah, not at this point. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for this very helpful program and presentation. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
And I would like to clarify, because the issue of renewables and some of our other fixed contracts, which most renewables are, don't fall under a hedging strategy because they're fixed. So currently, the current market for renewables are generally either fixed contracts with an escalator or not, or ownership, and in some cases we actually own the projects outright. So it's either through a power purchase agreement, which is a fixed contract, or an ownership piece of a project that we would be dealing with, our renewables. So none of that falls under any type of hedging program at the moment. Now, if we look out X number of years, when there's a preponderance of renewables, that will most likely change. And at that point, then we'll probably start talking about how we have a strategy for that kind of thing. But for the moment, we don't.
Public speaker, Herbert Milano.
Commission President Chen and Commissioners of the Glendale Water and Power and staff, my name is Herbert Milano. I think that many of the comments that I'm about to make, I think Commissioner Miller pretty much nailed it before I came here. But I think I want to express a couple of things, because obviously if, for us the consumer, if the utility is doing an excellent job of mitigating the risks, primarily the market risks, then we assume that that good diligence will turn into lower costs for the overall consumers. On the other hand, if you do make a major mistake, then we wind up paying. And to that regard, I think it's probably one of the most important activities and probably the most complex one that the utility performs. And I think might be the reason why Mr. Steiger is here, to handle that significant part of the utility problem. But as I look at risk mitigation, I think, Mr. Miller, you asked a really pertinent question. How do we really measure the performance of this particular program or this particular entity? Because when a comparison is made with regard to the things that we cannot control, such as war or acts of God, the weather, or the overall economy, it impacts all the utilities. So the comparison should be for that portion of the utility or these particular commitments that the utility is making. Compared to other utilities, we should be making those comparisons because they should be made accountable to some kind of measure. I look at, for example, Southwest Airlines and their history of mitigating, should we say, the risk with regard to the purchase of fuel. Year after year, they outperform every other airline, and not just by a small amount. All the conditions are the same, economic conditions, war, whatever. But they have excellence in that particular part of their business that allows them to do such fuel purchases so smart that they basically are able to reduce their cost, and they're incredibly competitive, and that's the reason why they're number one in the nation. And I think to that extent, we should perhaps have some way of evaluating the performance a year out with some other independent measure where they're not involved to see if they're really performing to a level that is expected by this commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item 5, oral communications. Herbert Milano.
Mr. President Chen and Commissioners, I have a PowerPoint presentation on an issue that has been, as you well know, having long in coming in my trying to determine what is the impact of the utility rates, primarily electricity, on residents, and as a side note also on businesses, which is also part of my interest because I pay commercial rates. So about a year, it has been more than a year since I requested some type of information, and as you well know, the cost was made, should we say, prohibitive to get this kind of basic information. But thanks to Commissioner Armenian last time and Councilman John Draymond, the Glendale Water and Power provided me a report of which I gave you a copy. The problem with that report is that it doesn't really allow me to determine in a more precise way what the impact is. So I took the information from that report and took information from the 2000 census. And by the way, Glendale's population has remained flat in 10 years. So I think the numbers from 2000 are probably just as good. So here's my PowerPoint. This is the final shut-off notices by zip code. And I mentioned it by zip code because the poverty rate and the income per family vary significantly across Glendale. So we see, for example, here that for zip code, for calendar year 2010, for zip code 91204, according to the census, there are 5,623 dwellings. 4,763 final notices were given during the year. Now, unfortunately, I don't know which ones are water or electricity, but I'm assuming that most of them are for electricity. And I don't know if it's residential or commercial, so I have to basically lump them all in. So just looking as, given those limitations, I see an 85 percentile during the year at one time or another, someone in that zip code received a final notice, 48-hour notice of shutoff. The number, by the way, of 85% is not surprising to me because I did a study on another city, in Decatur, Alabama, and it was 90% for the lowest income zip code. And so the information that is needed here is to find out how many of these were repeat notices that the same family received every 2 months. So based on the information that is on page 1 that I gave you, I basically assumed that this is a bi-monthly billing and made this particular chart from it. I want to qualify it that it is not so accurate as it can be because it does not have the breakdown that what I would normally expect to evaluate residential, the number of residences that during the year get at least one notice of, final notice of impending shutoff. And I think it's an important one for us to look at. Here, for example, we see that zip codes 91201, 91203, 91204, and 91205, if we go back to the previous slide, are the ones who are the most heavily impacted zip codes in the city. And that's a significant number of families that are being impacted with regard to their ability due to the economy and due to the rates. If we can proceed a couple more slides, please.
Is that accurate with 91201? If you look at 91201.
Yeah. That's the number of households is from the census, and the final notice is from the sheet that I gave you. That's a copy.
86.78 percentage of 66%.
It's an Excel spreadsheet, so I'm assuming that's the. Let me see. No, I may have changed the order. It's possible. Yeah, no, it is incorrect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should have checked that out.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a much higher number. No, you're absolutely right. That number is incorrect. Let's go to the next one, please. There's another slide. There we go. This slide is a little bit compressed, but I did add the 2010 rates as they are reported on the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report on the statistical section. And they're taken from all the other cities from their CAFR. And you notice that during the past 10 years, except for the big problem we had in 2001 with the rates, Glendale has consistently been significantly higher than the 4 nearby utilities, Pasadena, Burbank, and Los Angeles, and Los Angeles being by far the lowest. As you can see, LA increased it significantly in the past year, but unfortunately I believe that some people are looking at Glendale and see how high we are and say, well, they're charging that much, so we might as well charge like Glendale does. Nonetheless, this I think merits further study, and I would hope that the commissioners can help me in obtaining some more accurate information that I could use to get a better analysis of the impact of utility rates. Thank you.
Thank you.
Item number 6, old business.
I may have a couple of items.
Well, I know we noticed earlier that a couple of the items have been shifted out of this month's agenda, and so there's no problem with that for me, so we can just shift it to the following month. Is there anything else?
Yes. We have talked in the past about reformulating the strategic plan, and in our most recent mail packet, we got the second quarter report, very informative, by the way, comprehensive. What's the status of reformulating the plan, and do you anticipate reformulating the goals? Because I see that our in the plan, and we'll be hearing more about this, I think, in a future commission meeting, a number of goals we've fallen behind on, which I presume is a consequence of the anticipated reductions in revenue. And perhaps you could comment on. So 2 questions: where are we in reformulating the plan, and is there an expectation we would be reformulating goals?
We are currently just beginning the process to reformulate or basically course correct the plan, and so it will be put in place in the new fiscal year starting July.
Okay.
So that process will occur over the next couple of months, and within that process, there most likely will be some goals, how many I can't say, that will have to be recast.
Okay.
For the reasons that you've mentioned.
Okay, our next quarterly scoreboard update is in July, I have it. So would we be hearing at it in July, or would you be prepared? Because I think our meeting in July is July 11th. Can't say yet.
It's hard to say right now. It's gonna be very
anyway,
close.
it's in the works. It's in the works. Okay, very good. And along those lines, I don't really know how we formulated the goals last time with respect to expectations of revenue. Obviously, that something played into account there. Do we feel like we have more information related to revenue so that we could reliably predict what we're going to be able to perform?
The answer is yes. By a wide margin, we have far more or far better data, although it's not necessarily the most positive data, I will say that. But we do have financial data that will be used to formulate the...
Okay. I think what's going to be very important for ratepayers and customers to hear is that if is what they're not getting, if the revenue is not covering things like turnaround times for pipe or electrical equipment, that in your staff's best engineering judgment needs to be replaced within a certain time to be reliable, and how that might affect operation and maintenance costs or increase of failures and so on. So I'm sure you're well aware of that, and that will be taken care of. That covers all I had to say under old business. Thank you.
I noticed for May, we do have a review of capital improvement, the O&M programs, and fiscal state of utility. And that's...
I'm sorry, President Chen, that would fall under the agenda forecast.
Next item.
Right.
This is old business.
Should we move on to the next
Let's move on to the next agenda
Sure,
item if there's
sure.
no further old business.
Item number 7, new business, agenda forecast.
Yes, as I was saying earlier, I noticed that is scheduled for May. And I remember Mr. Milano's comment earlier about the need to look at the costs and seeing where we can cut the costs instead of starting our rate design with the revenue requirement. And I remember this is what we do all the time. When you come to us with the budget, we do review it, Mr. Milano, and we do go through this exercise where, you go over like the areas that you have to cut to meet a certain number in the budget, and what to defer, et cetera. So I think that's what's going to happen in May, right?
In our budget review, that will be part of it, yes.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks.
I have some other items. As I think many here are aware, Governor Brown declared the drought to be over. On the other hand, though, I think the conservation effort is going to have to continue, partly because our wholesaler is going to be continuing their effort, and in the Metropolitan Water District, that is. And I was hoping the director or somebody under him could elaborate and give a status report on where we are with the conservation ordinance and the impact of the governor's statement on that, and if it also explained to those viewing why we would continue implementing the conservation ordinance. Thank you.
As you mentioned, the formal drought has been lifted by the governor. However, our primary bulk supplier of water, Metropolitan Water District, has not as yet lifted any type of conservation or mandatory water restrictions on us. So at the moment, until something occurs with Met, which we expect something probably will, we are maintaining the mandatory water restrictions in place. Should that change, what will most likely change is we will lift the mandatory water restrictions, but continue to strongly recommend voluntary water conservation, water restrictions.
Okay. Oh, and do we anticipate that Metropolitan Water District would lift its conservation mandate, or can we say that?
I can't say for sure. The only thing that I can say with certainty is that whether or not the drought is lifted, and of course it has been lifted, still does not totally negate the issue of water conservation, because we are still severely restricted from importing our normal allocation of water from the Northern California water supply to Southern California. And that's actually just as significant an issue with our water restrictions as was the drought. So I can't make a formal...
But that restriction on the state water project supply is not dependent then on the precipitation. There's another factor involved, and could you elaborate?
There's an
If I may, under this topic, it's an interesting discussion. I do hate to get this off, but we do need to limit it just to the discussion of should we put an item on the agenda, and is there a second commissioner that's interested?
I thought we were in new business.
Well, we're under agenda forecast. If we were to specifically agendize under new business this topic, we could do that. So,
all right.
Regrettably, we'd have to put that on the agenda if another commissioner is interested.
Yes, I would be interested.
Okay, I have a couple of other items and a few other items here. Let's see. You had distributed in your second quarter report a scoreboard, and you showed delays, but in the schedule I noticed the delays were not shown. Is that something you could elaborate on when we have our...
If I had specifics, I could, yes.
Okay, yeah, I can show you that it's towards the end of the report. You have a schedule of this type, and there's nothing shown in red, so to speak. So there was a little bit of a conflicting report there.
That's the part. That's the actual plan itself, and that's the part that will be updated.
Okay, all right, very good. I wanted to acknowledge our director, Mr. Steiger, who I think many of you are aware was named as one of the movers and shakers of the utility industry by Intelligent Utility magazine, and I think everyone else in the Commission would join me in congratulating you on showing outstanding leadership.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Very much.
Yeah.
Also, on April 27th, we have Administrative Professional Day, and that includes a very important part of the staff, and I think the Commission ought to acknowledge and thank administrative professionals, seeing that we're not going to be able to meet before April 27th. So that is all I have for new business. Now we can go to the agenda forecast.
Yeah, definitely. I want to add my thanks to the staff as well. Many questions that you're able to answer and provide information for us, and beyond the call of duty, very, very often. Thank you. Okay. Do we have any other items? If not,
well, one thing let me mention on the agenda forecast. When we talk next month, I believe, on our fiscal state of utility, will you be can you elaborate a little bit on the impact of revenues on filling vacancies? I noticed we've had, that's just been an ongoing wound, so to speak. I guess it's mostly in your admin staff. And
we could address that.
Okay. Anyway, that's all I had to mention. Thank you.
no? Okay. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
Second.
Great. No objections. Motion carries. Meeting's adjourned.